Well, thank you so much, those of you who are sticking to the end of PPA to the very last presentation. I want to talk to you about paleopathology and inclusive, equitable, and sustainable development. So climate change, as we all know, is already having an impact on global public health, human security, food and water security, migration flows, and governments and non-governmental organizations are considering potential impacts and creating their plans for managing natural disasters, global warming, and associated environmental change. The ability to understand global warming and to predict and plan for the future relies on historical sciences. Paleoclimate science uses proxies to infer climatic and environmental fluctuations in the past, examining correlations among CO2 levels, mean global surface temperatures, ice coverage, sea level rise, and paleoecology to develop models for prediction. And historical social sciences, including anthropology and archaeology, are also uniquely situated to contribute to these conversations based on our examinations of past human perceptions of and responses to climate and environmental change. So in 2015, the UN defined 17 priorities for research on global sustainable development, and they specifically called for scientists and other scholars to please engage with the specific topics and research priorities outlined in this paradigm. So human health is one of the major areas of concern. Anthropogenic climate and environmental changes are occurring at a scale and a magnitude that's unprecedented in human history, and they're already having a significant impact on human health and well-being. So the health of human populations, as we all already know, is sensitive to shifts in weather patterns and other aspects of climate change directly. Changes in temperature, precipitation, extreme weather and climate events, ecological disruption, reduced food production, altering the habitat of disease vectors, social responses to climate change, including migration and having refugee status. And there are important research gaps that remain, particularly in low-income countries, concerning morbidity and mortality from higher ambient temperatures and intense heat, the higher risk of undernutrition, health consequences of work disruptions, higher risk of food, water, and vector-borne diseases. And paleopathologists, as anthropologists with a long-term perspective, are critical to this conversation, as we recognize that humans are biological organisms enmeshed within an ecological system and completely interdependent on other species across the kingdoms of life. And in addition, as biological scientists, we recognize the importance of the fact that global warming is also accompanied by the 6th mass extinction, and we deeply understand the significance of the third epidemiological transition. And finally, we're also uniquely positioned and poised to examine the powerful challenges posed by emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases as we increasingly disturb wild spaces, interact with other species in detrimental new ways, and increasingly burn our antibiotic bridges to health and safety. So if you've attended any of the sessions at the Paleopathology Association this year, or any of the large number of bioarchaeological talks at AAPA this year, you know that paleopathologists are already working on topics that yield insights into the long array of specific health and well-being questions that are being posed by policymakers around the world who are grappling with climate and environmental change. But there are two problems. Number one, these policymakers are not reading our literature. And number two, our literature is not framing the problem within a language that they understand. So how do we address these research priorities? And what falls under these research priorities? Well, let's take some examples. Research priority number 3, good health and well-being. Obviously, we know that half the world's population today does not have access to adequate medical and health services. Maternal, infant, and child mortality is a major challenge for life expectancy around the world. Air pollution, inadequate food and water sanitation, and other challenges of living in modern urban communities leads to occupational and mental health risks. Many diseases that we thought to be a thing of the past are re-emerging as potent problems. emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, and particularly diseases paleopathologists study like tuberculosis, malaria, neglected tropical diseases, and insect-borne diseases represent major challenges for a warming world, with increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters combined with overpopulation, overcrowding, millions living in impoverished conditions, and increasing antibiotic resistance. So environmental degradation, capitalism, and global poverty are increasingly bringing us into contact with environments and other species in ways that promote health problems and emerging infections. And paleopathologists can contribute to these conversations. For example, there are certain epidemiological patterns we're all familiar with that characterize moments across human history when communities settled down in crowded sedentary villages and or began relying on food production, or we experienced industrialization. Currently, we're at the beginning of this third transition, in which increased sedentism, obesity, and the reliance on technology are contributing to a rise in degenerative diseases. And we're also in a period when emerging and re-emerging infections are changing human disease ecologies. So Roberts 2021, for example, examines some of these specific challenges of the third epidemiological transition within the context of climate and environmental change. Research priorities 1, 2, 5, and 10 can be condensed down into inequality, poverty, and hunger. Climate change impacts human communities differently based on our historical trajectories, culture, and social environments. And paleopathologists always are thinking about health within the context of the social conditions: inequality, urbanism, migration, culture contact, new economic and political forms, local biologies, and then how those impact human health and well-being. And intersectionality as an emerging theoretical framework reminds us also that we must consider a variety of axes of identity beyond the level of urban, poor, or immigrant communities when we think about the social determinants of health. So health can be constrained in important ways by unequal social positioning. However, as anthropologists, we also know that migration and social complexity can also open space for human agency, and expanding socioeconomic or political opportunities, changing dynamics in social relations, and sociocultural change more broadly can occur in the face of climate change. So socioeconomic inequality, if we just take one of those priorities, priority 10, shapes health outcomes in the face of climate and environmental change, and we know this as paleopathologists. For example, Nystrom and Robin Shug in 2021 provide the longue durée perspective on health in this context, and this study demonstrates how to powerfully combine evolutionary, biocultural, political economy, critical medical anthropology, and other critical social theoretical frameworks to create a deeply nuanced and contextualized view of contemporary anthropogenic climate change and human agency, resilience, and suffering across the millennia of human environmental interaction. So what about research priority number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions? In some cases, it's important for anthropologists to get involved so we can critique notions of the benefit of a strong state-level control, the unproblematized love of social institutions, and the continuing predominance of capitalist modes of thinking found in policy and planning circles. So it's commonly held as a view in global development and policy planning around the world that climate change is going to lead to increased migration flows and that competition for resources will result in increased levels of violence. This is another area in which paleopathologists can make a very strong contribution. And the reality is that violent responses to instability are also likely in cases where social institutions are intact, but were built on a foundation of social inequality, injustice, and deprivation. So we know as paleopathologists that violence is not a natural outcome for humans. Paleopathologists have demonstrated many circumstances where interpersonal and community-based violence were not substantially correlated with periods of climate or environmental change. Leslie Gregorica's work in Oman, for example. Martin and Herod in 2021 demonstrate interpersonal violence increased during a period of environmental change, but these behaviors were related to specific historical, cultural, and social circumstances, and an ideological phenomenon that promoted this behavior over other alternatives. So paleopathology can show that violence is not necessarily abated by strong social institutions, particular forms of government, or tighter social control. These phenomena can also represent forms of violence, or they may encourage violent behavior. And also, there's no single meaning of or overarching trajectory of violent behavior in human history. This is a really important contribution that paleopathologists can make. Research priority 15, life on land. Life on land refers to a goal of promoting healthy relationships with the natural environment and other species. The UN is focused on protecting and restoring terrestrial ecosystems, managing forests sustainably, understanding desertification and combating it, halting environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. And this research priority also includes health impacts of making a living or occupying extreme environments, subsistence transitions in the past, all areas in which paleopathologists are already working. So one way in which we can contribute to this conversation is by our focus on endemic diseases. Paleopathologists are often considering our entanglements with other organisms and how the landscapes and ecosystems we inhabit can influence, constrain, and provide unique opportunities for human communities facing climate and environmental change. So in these studies by Tallis and Vlock, for example, looking at evidence for thalassemia, which is a long-term adaptation to malarial environments and vector-borne diseases, Sean Halcrow's work in these same environments where she found high neonatal mortality, possibly suggesting placental malaria was operating as a selective pressure on these communities. So what insights can paleopathology contribute to inclusive, equitable, sustainable development? For many decades, bioarchaeologists and paleopathologists have been conducting research on human-environmental interactions in the past and studying phenomena that will be highly valuable for contemporary planning and policymaking. Our scholarship addresses the sociocultural and political dimensions of climate change for the past 12,000 years, and our data allow for nuanced interpretations of short-term strategies and long-term trajectories of human responses to environmental change. But we need to frame our research within the stated priorities of the UN Sustainable Development Goals if we're interested in making our work relevant to a larger audience and for creating a sustainable future. And I want to say thank you to everyone who's hung in there to the very last presentation of the PPA. I appreciate it, and I hope to see more paleopathologists working on these really important questions in the future. And I just want to say thank you to all of my collaborators, colleagues, and funding organizations.